machine told him 3 days before anyone else knew, and when he reported it, they reassigned him to inventory. That is where this story begins. Not with fire, not with screaming, not with the particular wet sound that chaos makes when it finally stops pretending to be something else. It begins with a number that was slightly wrong, in a report that no one read, filed by a man whose job was to notice exactly that kind of thing. His name was Solan Verath, Enginseer Primus, seconded from the Forge World Solix Tertius to the 7th Battle Group of the Ironclad Crimson Crusade. 31 years of service to the Omnissiah, 11 combat deployments, a body that was, by now, more blessed steel than original flesh, and a mind that had been trained, at great institutional expense, to hear the difference between a machine that was failing and a machine that was lying. He was very good at his work. He wished, in the weeks that followed, that he had been worse. The immovable conviction was a strike cruiser of the Sable Paladins chapter, on loan to the Crusade's command elements for the duration of the Verath campaign. She was an old ship. 4,000 years of void service had left her hull thick with honor markings, and her machine spirit layered with the deep, slow dignity of something that had survived long enough to develop opinions. Verath respected her. She was honest the way old machines were honest. Bluntly, immediately, without the political hesitation of the humans she carried. On the morning of the 77th day of the Crusade's stall above Verath IV, she told him something was wrong. He was running a standard diagnostic cycle on her biological monitoring systems. Routine work, the kind of maintenance task that kept a mind like Verath's from unraveling during the endless orbital waiting that war, in practice, consisted of mostly. The biomonitors tracked crew health indices across all inhabited decks: heart rate, respiration, cortisol levels, sleep architecture. Standard Mechanicus practice on any vessel carrying more than 500 souls. The data fed into a cogitator suite that flagged anomalies for the apothecarian's attention. What flagged was not an anomaly in the traditional sense. It was a pattern. Across 3 adjacent decks, 5, 6, and 7, the biometric readings of 847 crew members were converging, not toward illness, not toward the elevated readings that stress or combat proximity produced. They were converging toward each other, heart rates drifting toward a shared average, respiration cycles gradually synchronizing, REM sleep architecture, across different crew members sleeping different hours in different bunks, slowly settling into an identical signature. Verath looked at the data for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at all things that did not make sense, carefully, without assumption, with the particular patience of a man who knew that the universe was not obligated to be immediately legible. He ran the numbers 3 times. He checked for sensor drift, for calibration error, for the kind of systemic cogitator fault that produced false harmony in raw data. The sensors were perfect. The calibration was exact. The data was real. 847 human beings were slowly beginning to share a single biological rhythm, and the rate of convergence, plotted over the previous 19 days, was accelerating. He filed a full report, attached all supporting data, marked it as a priority amber medical anomaly requiring immediate apothecarian review, submitted it through the proper channel to the ship's senior chirurgeon and, as protocol demanded, copied it to the battle group's command log. 6 hours later, a reassignment order arrived in his personal Vox bead. He was to report to Munitions Sub-Level 3 for inventory and cataloging duties, effective immediately. No explanation, no sender name beyond the standard administrative sigil of the Crusade's logistics corps. He read the order twice. Then he put on his work robes, picked up his data slate, and went to count ammunition. This is the part that most men would have let go. Verath understood that about himself. that he was not most men, and that this distinction was not a comfort. The Mechanicus trained obedience as thoroughly as it trained precision, and most of his colleagues would have accepted the reassignment as the inevitable friction of military bureaucracy, filed it in the part of their mind reserved for institutional indignities, and moved on. The report existed. The duty had been discharged. Whatever the command structure did with it afterward was no longer his problem. He was in munitions sub-level 3 for 40 minutes before he started running secondary diagnostics on his data slate. Not on the biometrics. He had been separated from that system's access. On the reassignment order itself, he traced it back through the logistics chain, following the administrative sigil through 3 layers of automated routing. The order had originated from a deck officer's terminal, a deck officer who, according to the personnel roster, had been on extended medical leave for the past 12 days. Someone had used a vacant posting to move him. He wrote that down in his private log, a habit from his earliest years of service, one the Mechanicus encouraged, and the military hierarchy technically prohibited but practically ignored. He kept the log encrypted, stored in the secondary memory architecture of his cranial augmetics rather than any external system. It was his, not the ship's, not the Crusade's. On the 77th day, he reassigned the following biometric anomaly report. Reassignment order traced to a terminal belonging to a crew member currently listed as medically absent. Possible administrative error. Possible deliberate routing. No conclusion drawn. Observation logged. He put the data slate away and returned to counting munitions. The guard's name was Petion Arl. Verath knew this because the man had been standing at the intersection of corridors 7 Gamma and 7 Delta every time Verath had passed in the past 3 days. And on the 3rd day, professional habit made Verath stop and look at him properly. Arl was awake. He was upright. His las rifle was held in a correct at-ease position, and his uniform was regulation clean. By every visible measure, he was performing his post with complete adequacy. He was also standing at an intersection that led to nothing of particular security importance, a stretch of corridor containing storage compartments and an environmental systems junction. There was no assignment in the ship's security rota that would put an armsman here for 3 days running. Verath stopped in front of him. "Armsman," he said, "what is your posted assignment?" Arl looked at him. The pause before he answered was 1.4 seconds. Verath counted it without meaning to. Precision was involuntary in him by now, as reflexive as breathing. "Corridor security," Arl said. "Sir." "Corridor security," Verath repeated. "For how long?" Another pause. Slightly shorter this time. 11 days, sir." Verath studied the man's face. Arl was perhaps 30 years old, a veteran by the look of his rank markings, experienced enough that 11 days of standing watch in an empty corridor should have produced either complaints or visible exhaustion. He showed neither. His eyes were clear. His expression was not blank exactly. That was the wrong word. It was settled. The way a man looks when he has finished making all the decisions he intends to make. 11 days, Verath said, and something that was not quite a chill, being as he was a man with a body temperature regulated by augmetic systems, moved through him. "Who assigned you here?" The pause this time was 2.1 seconds. "The orders came through proper channels," Arl said. Verath thanked him and walked away. Behind him, he heard nothing. No shift of weight, no adjustment of posture. He stopped 10 meters down the corridor and turned back. Arl had not moved. I was not watching him leave. Was simply standing, facing the intersection, rifle at rest, eyes on nothing at all. Verath added him to the log. That night, the Conviction's night cycle, the artificial dimming of corridor lumens that approximated a schedule the ship's crew needed, even in the perpetual dark of the void. Verath sat in his cell with the door sealed and his data slate on his knee. He had pulled the biometric data again through a secondary access node he used for maintenance work. A back channel the reassignment hadn't closed, because whoever had closed the primary channel either hadn't known about it or hadn't thought it mattered. They should have thought it mattered. He spread the data across his slate's display and looked at what he had. 847 synchronized readings. All of them, every single one, on decks 5, 6, and 7. He was on deck 7. His own reading should have been in the cluster. He was in the monitoring zone. He had been here for 11 weeks. Whatever was producing the convergence had had the same access to him as to every other crew member on these 3 decks. He searched for his own designation code in the synchronized cluster. It was not there. His readings were isolated, normal, individual, entirely his own, as if whatever was drawing the others together had passed over him, or around him, or had simply not yet reached him. He sat with that for a long time. Then the monitoring system updated, a real-time refresh, pulling the latest biometric readings from the deck sensors. The cluster count changed, 848. He looked at the new entry. His own designation code looked back at him. He checked the readings attached to it. Heart rate, 62 beats per minute. Respiration, 12 cycles per minute. REM architecture, matching. All of it, matching the cluster's shared signature exactly, perfectly, without deviation. He looked at his own hands. He could feel his heart rate, could feel the particular elevated rhythm of a man who has just received a shock his body has registered before his mind has finished processing it. He counted the beats, 91 per minute. The system said 62. He sat very still for a long time in the dim yellow light of his cell, and he thought about the difference between what the machine was reporting and what he could feel, and he thought about which one he was supposed to trust. And then he opened his private log and wrote a single line. Something knows my designation code. Something has been watching long enough to learn it, and it wants me to know that it has. He sealed the log. He did not sleep. Outside his cell, somewhere deep in the bones of the old ship, something that had learned to be patient continued its work, quietly, warmly, in the dark. Chapter 2. Bilateral Architecture. He pulled the panel off the wall, expecting wiring. What he found had learned to look like wiring. That distinction between being a thing and learning to resemble it would occupy the part of Verath's mind that never fully quieted for the rest of his life. It is the distinction that separates a malfunction from an intention. A machine fails. It does not decide to fail. It does not study the thing it is replacing and practice its appearance before moving in. Whatever was behind that panel had done both. It had been thorough. I had been patient, and it had been there long enough that the original wiring had not been torn out. It had been absorbed, integrated, consumed so gradually that the transition point was almost impossible to find. Almost. Verath found it. That was, in the end, both his gift and his sentence. He had not slept. This was not unusual for him. His augmetics could sustain cognitive function through sleep deprivation that would incapacitate an unaugmented man, cycling rest through individual neural clusters in rotating intervals so that no part of him fully stopped while the whole remained operational. He had spent the night hours running the biometric discrepancy through every analytical framework he had. The conclusion was always the same. The system claimed he was synchronized. His own body told him otherwise. One of them was lying. By the ship's morning cycle, he had made a decision. If something was wrong with the monitoring system, the error would originate in the physical infrastructure. The sensor nodes, the relay conduits, the data routing architecture between the biological monitors and the cogitator suite. That infrastructure ran through the environmental systems junctions on Deck 7, the same corridor where Armsman Arl had been standing for 11 days, the same stretch of ship that contained, if his mapping of the biometric cluster was accurate, the highest concentration of synchronized crew. He went at 0340 when the corridor was empty and the night cycle lumens were at minimum. Thin strips of amber light set low against the deck plating, designed to allow navigation without disrupting the sleep of nearby crew quarters. He brought his standard maintenance kit. He brought his data slate. He brought, with a deliberateness he did not entirely examine, the short-hafted cutting tool he normally used for removing corroded bolts, heavy, blunt, and capable of functioning as something other than a cutting tool if circumstances required it. Armsman Arl was not at his post. Verath noted this, logged it, and moved to the environmental junction panel at the corridor's midpoint. The panel opened without resistance. He swept his lumen across the interior. Standard wiring. Grey insulated cables in the correct gauge for environmental system relays, routed in the correct configuration, stamped at regular intervals with the Imperial Aquilar in the correct ink. He checked the labeling against the ship's schematic on his data slate. Everything matched. He ran a surface scan with his mechadendrite probe. The readings were normal. He was about to close the panel when the probe's thermal sensor registered a variance. Not a significant one. 0.3 degrees above ambient. Well within the range of that standard current carrying cable produced through resistive heating. Entirely explainable. He looked at the cable again. The standard wiring ran in a bundle toward the upper left of the junction. In the lower right, a secondary bundle ran parallel. Similar gauge, similar color, similar labeling. He checked the schematic. There was no secondary bundle in this junction. The schematic showed a single routing path. He reached into the panel and touched the secondary bundle. It was warm, not the dry, consistent warmth of resistive heating, the warmth of a cable carrying current and nothing more. This was different. This was the warmth of something that generated its own heat from within, the warmth of metabolism, the warmth of a living thing resting against his palm, and he became aware, with the particular clarity that comes to precise minds in moments of profound wrongness, that the bundle was not entirely still. It moved, slowly, rhythmically, a pulse so faint he might have dismissed it as vibration from the ship's engines if the engines had been running. They were not. The ship was at anchor in orbit. Her drives were cold. Verath did not move his hand. He made himself hold contact, made himself feel it completely, without flinching away from the knowledge of what he was touching, because he understood that the moment he pulled back, he would spend the next hour convincing himself he had imagined it. 12 pulses per minute. He counted them. He extracted a sample. Precise, minimal, excised from a terminal node where the bundle thinned. A segment no longer than his smallest finger, cut cleanly and sealed in a specimen canister from his kit before the cut ends had finished their slow, directionless reaching. He told himself the reaching was a reflexive mechanical response of severed flexible conduit. He almost believed it. He sealed the panel. He walked back to his cell with the canister in his coat and his cutting tool in his hand. He did not run. Running would have meant acknowledging, in his body before his mind, what he was beginning to understand. He was not yet ready to do that. Under analysis, the sample produced results that his cogitator suite spent 11 minutes attempting to reject before accepting them as valid. The material was transitional. At the molecular level, it existed in a state that had no precise designation in any Mechanicus classificatory system he could access. Not fully organic, not fully synthetic, but something in active, directed movement between the two. Its carbon structure was biological in origin. Its conductive properties were mechanical in function, and the directionality of its internal structure, the microscopic architecture of how its components were arranged, was not random. The way natural growth was random. It was ordered, deliberately, specifically, geometrically ordered, as though every molecule had been placed according to a plan. He had encountered deliberately ordered biological material before. The Tyranids produced it. So, at considerable remove, did certain strains of chaos-touched mutation. But this was neither. The Tyranid logic was evolutionary, optimized for predation, for consumption, for the conversion of biomass into functional weapon organisms. This material had no predatory function. It was not consuming, it was connecting. Its entire architecture was relational, built to carry information between 2 points, to bridge a gap, to form part of a larger network. It was wiring. It was wiring that had grown. He sat with that conclusion until it stopped feeling impossible, which took longer than he would have liked to admit. Then he started mapping. Over the following 6 hours, moving through Deck 7 in segments during the corridor's quieter intervals, Verath located 11 additional junction panels containing the secondary bundles. He did not touch them again. He logged their positions, their approximate density, their routing paths. He was looking for a pattern, for the logic that determined where the organic wiring ran and where it did not. What he found was not the pattern he expected. He had assumed, because it was the rational assumption, that the material would follow the ship's existing conduit paths, that it would route itself along the same corridors as the standard wiring, building a parallel nervous system that mirrored the Conviction's own. That was the efficient approach. That was what an engineer would do. The organic wiring did not follow conduit paths. It followed people. He plotted the 11 junction locations against the ship's personnel density map. The distribution of crew quarters, duty stations, mess halls, recreation spaces. The correlation was absolute. The bundles were the densest where the crew spent the most time. They thinned to nothing in unused spaces. They concentrated around sleeping quarters, not the corridors outside them, but the interior walls, the partitions between bunks. As if the material was orienting itself toward the warmth of sleeping bodies, the way roots orient toward water. Not replacing the ship's nervous system, building a second one. And the second one was not a map of the Conviction. It was a map of her crew. He added this to his log, then immediately ran a compression and secondary encryption pass over the entire file, burying it 4 layers deep in his cranial architecture. If the ship's own systems were compromised, if the monitoring network was being routed through the organic wiring, and he was increasingly certain it was, then anything stored externally was already read. Whatever he knew, he kept only where he alone could reach it, the inside of his own skull. He had never before considered whether that was sufficient protection. He considered it now. The compartment was not on any schematic he had been issued. He found it by following the densest routing path of organic bundles, the thickest concentration, running along the base of a wall in Corridor 7 Alpha toward a section of hull he had always assumed, from the schematic, contained a void-facing equipment bay. The schematic was wrong, or it had been altered. There was a door, painted the same gray as the surrounding wall, with a standard mechanical lock that opened when he applied the maintenance override he carried for environmental system access. Inside was darkness and the smell of recycled air that had been breathed many times. He swept his lumen across the room. 43 crew members, standing, evenly spaced, as if arranged, eyes open, utterly still, not dead. Their chests moved, slowly, in perfect unison. He watched them breathe. He counted the cycles, 12 per minute, every one of them. He swept the lumen across face after face, And what he found there was not the vacancy of the unconscious. They were present, aware. Their eyes tracked his light with a slow, unhurried attention, as if they were watching something mildly interesting from a great distance. He backed out of the compartment. He sealed the door. He stood in the corridor for 6 minutes, leaning against the wall with his hand still on the lock, and he ran through every possible rational framework available to him for what he had just seen, and none of them held. He had one tool left: information. He accessed the personnel database through his secondary maintenance node, pulled the duty records for all 43 faces. Every one of them had logged shifts in the past 24 hours, active postings, task completions, meal records. One had filed a maintenance request that morning. Another had logged a successful weapons drill. On paper, in the system, they were the most present, most active, most functional 43 crew members on the ship. Something had been signing them in. Something that understood the bureaucracy of an imperial vessel thoroughly enough to maintain 43 separate personnel records without triggering an absence flag. Something that understood precisely how the institution monitored its own people and had learned to speak the institution's language back at it. He pulled the cross-reference he had been avoiding. Every crew member in that room had one shared characteristic in their records: a single common event logged during the fleet's arrival in Verath's Reach 11 weeks ago, a routine physical clearance through the ship's apothecarian, required for all personnel before combat deployment. Standard procedure. He had done it himself. He searched for his own record. Physical clearance. Apothecarian, Deck 4. 11 weeks ago. Cleared fit for deployment. He sat in the corridor outside the sealed compartment for a long time. He thought about the sample in his specimen canister, the cut end that had reached, slowly, toward nothing, before he sealed it away. He thought about the monitoring system that claimed his biometrics matched the cluster exactly while his own body said otherwise. He thought about the fact that whatever had been introduced during those physical clearances had had 11 weeks inside him. He opened his log. Then on day 78, the organic architecture does not follow the ship. It follows the crew. 43 personnel confirmed in an unscheduled state. Conscious, coordinated, maintained in the system as active. Physical clearance records suggest a common vector, the apothecarian intake 11 weeks ago. My own clearance was among them. I have no way to determine what was introduced, or how far it has progressed, or whether the fear I am currently experiencing is my own. He paused. His mechadendrite stylus hovered over the entry. That last question, he wrote, is the one I am least equipped to answer, and the one I cannot stop asking. He closed the log. Behind the sealed door, 43 chests rose and fell as one. In the walls, in the dark spaces behind every panel on Deck 7, something warm and patient continued its slow and deliberate work, building, connecting, growing toward a completion that it had been planning for much longer than 11 weeks, longer perhaps than the Crusade itself. Chapter 3. The Architecte's Grammar. He had spent his life decoding the language of machines. He had never considered that something might be written in him. That is the precise moment this story becomes unbearable. Not when the wiring breathed. Not when the 43 stood in the dark with their eyes open and their lungs moving as one. Those were external horrors. Things outside Verath's skin that he could observe, catalogue, and maintain a professional distance from, however thin that distance had become. The moment it becomes unbearable is the moment the outside and the inside stop being different places. The moment a man looks at the evidence and realizes the investigation has always been pointed at him. Most men, faced with that realization, find a way not to finish the thought. Verath finished it. That was his nature. That was his tragedy. He had been built by training, by augmetic enhancement, by 31 years of service to a creed that treated incomplete data as a moral failure, to follow an analytical thread wherever it led, regardless of what waited at the end. It led here, into the worst room he had ever been in. The room was his own skull. The full internal diagnostic was a procedure he had performed twice before in his career. Once after a combat deployment left shrapnel embedded near his primary neural relay, and once as part of a routine decade cycle review at Solix Tertius. It required partial suppression of the upper consciousness. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, but a deliberate stepping back of the aware self to allow the diagnostic subroutines unrestricted access to the augmetic architecture without interference from active cognition. He would be present in the way a room is present, capable of receiving input, incapable of acting on it. He had never found the procedure unsettling before. He sealed his cell. He sat in the center of the floor because the chair felt insufficient. He wanted the cold solidity of the deck plating, the honest weight of the ship beneath him. He ran the pre-diagnostic checks. Everything was nominal. He initiated the suppression sequence. He felt the familiar recession of active thought, the loosening of the deliberate self, the way the world became briefly enormous and distant, and he came back. The suppression sequence had completed. The diagnostic had run. His systems were reporting results, waiting patiently in his field of vision as amber data strings. He blinked, orienting. His body felt used in the way it felt after extended mechadendrite work. A specific weariness in the neural connectors at his shoulder junctions, the kind produced by hours of fine manipulation. He checked the time. The diagnostic should have taken 4 hours. 7 hours and 12 minutes had passed. He did not move. He sat on the floor of his cell and looked at the timestamp, and then looked at his mechadendrite housings, and then looked at the timestamp again, with the particular stillness of a man who understands that his next action is the most important one he will take, because it will determine whether he is still the kind of person who takes actions at all. He checked the diagnostic results first. His augmetics were clean, all systems nominal, no detected foreign material in any mechanical component, no corruption in his data storage architecture. Whatever the missing 3 hours had contained, it had not damaged him in any way his own systems could measure. He checked the wear patterns on his mechadendrites. 6 hours of fine mechanical work, minimum. The micro-abrasions on the manipulation tips were consistent with detailed, intricate, sustained operation. He had been doing something for 3 hours that he had no memory of, something that required his hands. He pulled the corridor surveillance feed. The footage was intact. He had half expected it to be deleted, had prepared himself for the particular cold confirmation of finding a gap, a cut, evidence of external interference. The footage was not deleted. It was complete, continuous, unaltered. He watched himself stand up from the floor of his cell at the 1 hour mark of the diagnostic suppression, the point at which his upper consciousness should have been at its most deeply stepped back. He watched himself check his mechadendrites with a brief, efficient motion. He watched himself open his cell door and walk into the corridor. His face was calm, more than calm. There was an ease to it, a looseness around the jaw, a particular quality of rest in the muscles around his eyes that he had never seen in his own face before. He was not, in the footage, performing calmly. He was not suppressing distress and producing a functional mask over it, the way he had learned to do in combat, the way most soldiers learned because it was either that or come apart. He was genuinely, deeply, structurally at ease, as if every question he had ever carried had been answered and set down. He watched himself walk to the sealed compartment on Corridor 7 Alpha and enter a 7-digit code into the lock. He did not know that code. He had used a maintenance override to enter the compartment the previous day. Whatever code he was entering now was not a code he had ever consciously learned. He watched himself open the door and walk inside. He watched himself stand among the 43 for 70 minutes and 4 seconds. He watched his chest move in time with theirs, 12 breaths per minute. He watched himself leave, walk back to his cell, sit in the center of the floor, and enter the suppression end sequence that returned full consciousness. He watched his own face change as awareness came back, watched the ease drain out of it, and the familiar tension of a thinking, uncertain man return to its architecture. He paused the footage. He sat for a very long time. He had gone in there himself, without coercion, without visible distress. He had gone in there as though it was a reasonable thing to do, as though standing in the dark with 43 synchronized bodies was simply where he had needed to be for 70 minutes on a Tuesday during the 78th day of a failed crusade. The question that the footage produced was not what happened to me. The question, the one that cut deepest, the one that would not stop being asked, was this: which part of me went? Because something had gone. Something wearing his face and moving in his body had walked calmly to that compartment and stood in there without distress and breathed with the others and returned without apparent conflict. And the part of him that was reviewing the footage, the part that was afraid, that was cold, that was running analytical frameworks over the evidence with shaking hands it was trying to keep still, that part had not been present for it. Were they the same person? Were they separating? Was the ease he had seen in his own face the face of a man being freed of something, or the face of a man having something essential removed? He did not know. That was the horror, not the monster in the walls, not the 43. This, not knowing whether the fear he was currently experiencing was the last true signal coming from an uncorrupted mind, or whether it was a remnant, a pilot light, deliberately preserved to power something he hadn't yet been shown. He worked because it was the only thing that kept the question at bay. He had always worked that way, used precision as a bulwark against the spaces where helplessness lived. He pulled the organic wiring sample back out of its canister and ran a deeper analysis, looking not at its material composition, but at its structural logic. The geometry of how it was arranged, the grammar of its design. The pattern he found there sent him into the sealed Xenotech archive partition in his own cranial memory. Records he had been granted access to during a brief Mechanicus research secondment. Records that were not secret exactly, but were not distributed to general Enginseer postings because their contents were considered destabilizing to orthodox Mechanicus doctrine. He had read them thoroughly and filed them away in the part of his mind reserved for things that were true but not useful on a daily basis. He found what he was looking for in 11 minutes. He wished it had taken longer. He wished he hadn't found it at all. The internal architecture of the organic wiring, the microscopic geometry of its component arrangement, the specific relational logic of how it connected node to node, matched, with a precision that left no room for coincidence, the documented internal structure of a noctilith crown. He sat with that match for a long time. A noctilith crown was a chaos artifact. Blackstone primarily, that strange mineral with its unique relationship to psychic force, forged into a specific configuration that thinned the boundary between real space and the immaterium. Orcish in origin, corrupted by chaos over 10 millennia into weapons of concentrated warp bleeding. The Imperium had encountered them. I had feared them, had occasionally captured and attempted to study them, which was where his archived records originated. But the noctilith crown his archive described was a forged object. Mineral. Static. You made it from blackstone and ritual and will, and it stood where you placed it and bled the warp into the world around it. What was growing through the immovable conviction was not forged. It was grown, and it was not Blackstone. It was the crew. He ran the calculation twice, because the first time his cogitator suite flagged it as a probable input error and ran an automatic correction. The second time, he locked the correction function and forced the raw calculation through. The organic wiring was building the crown's structural geometry using biological mechanical hybrid material, living material. The crew of the immovable conviction were not being infected by the architect. They were not being controlled by it in the crude, fungal way that chaos corruption usually worked. That blunt override of will and flesh, that burning replacement of self with something louder. They were being incorporated, slowly, precisely. Each synchronized body has an element. Each strand of organic wiring has a connection between elements. The whole fleet, all 14,000 souls across every ship in the 7th Battle Group's anchor formation, being gradually, methodically, invisibly restructured into a living noctilith crown of a scale and sophistication that the architect had presumably been planning for longer than anyone aboard had been alive. It did not want to destroy the Crusade. It was using the Crusade as material, as for architecture, as the finest available medium for something it intended to build. When it was complete, when the last connection was made, and the structure reached whatever threshold the architect had calculated as sufficient, a living crown of 14,000 souls would open something in the Verath system that would not close. A corridor, a wound, a door held permanently open by the weight of 14,000 synchronized heartbeats, all pressing against the boundary between reality and the immaterium from the inside. He stared at the calculation for a very long time. Then he checked the spread rate, the pace of conversion across the fleet over the past 11 weeks, and calculated the completion threshold, 9 days. He pulled the Crusade command schedule. Fleet Admiral Verath had ordered a full fleet advance on Verath 4. Every ship, every soul. A coordinated assault pushed into the system where the architect had been waiting, into the precise spatial position where a completed living crown would have maximum effect on the warp geography of the system. The advance was scheduled in 8 days. He sat in his cell surrounded by data and amber light, and the distant felt pulse of something warm in the walls. He drafted a communique to Crusade Command. Emergency priority. Full data package attached. He had the message composed and encrypted and addressed within 4 minutes. Then he stopped. He sat with his finger above the transmit key, and he thought about the monitoring system that had claimed his biometrics matched the cluster. He thought about the surveillance footage and the face that was his face, wearing an expression he had never felt. He thought about the organic wiring routing through the Vox relays, through the tertiary nodes, through the connective tissue of the ship's own communications infrastructure. Every message he sent would pass through the ship's systems. The ship's systems were not, at this point, entirely the ship's systems. He thought about the reassignment order routed through a vacant posting. He thought about 43 crew members being logged as present and active while they stood in the dark in an unscheduled room. He thought about the particular thoroughness of something that had studied the Imperium's own bureaucratic language well enough to speak it back without error. Whatever was growing through the conviction understood how the institution monitored itself. It had been managing that monitoring for 11 weeks. If he sent the communique, it would be read before it arrived. And then he thought about something worse. He thought about Fleet Admiral Verath, sitting in his command throne aboard the fleet flagship, 8 days from ordering 14,000 souls into the final position the architects needed them. He thought about the physical clearance intake 11 weeks ago, required for all personnel. Standard procedure, all personnel. He thought about the order that had moved him to munitions inventory, routed through a terminal belonging to someone on medical leave. and about who would have needed him away from the biometric monitoring suite at exactly the moment his report might have triggered an investigation. He thought about what level of authority it required to redirect an Enginseer Primus. He thought about Fleet Admiral Kavreth. He did not send the communique. He opened his private log instead. On day 78, late cycle. The fleet is a crown. 14,000. 9 days to completion. Advance ordered in 8. I cannot transmit. I cannot confirm whether command is compromised. I cannot confirm whether I am compromised. I have 3 hours of my own time I cannot account for. And in those 3 hours, my body went somewhere and did something, and came back looking more rested than I have felt in 11 weeks. He paused. I am the only person on this ship who is afraid. I do not know if that means I am the only person still myself. I do not know if my fear is the last genuine signal from an uncorrupted mind, or whether it is the one thing the architects decided to preserve. I do not know which answer is worse. I have 9 days. I have to find someone else who is still afraid. Chapter 4. 14,000 heartbeats. He went to the chaplain because the chaplain was the only man left aboard who might still be afraid of dying. He was wrong about that too. Understand what it means to be wrong in that particular way. It is not the wrongness of a miscalculation, of a number entered incorrectly, of a variable overlooked. Those errors are correctable. You find the mistake, you revise the output, you proceed with better data. This was a different species of wrong. This was the wrongness of a man who had built his last remaining hope on an assumption and had not examined the assumption, because examining it would have required admitting how little hope he actually had. Verath was precise about almost everything. He had allowed himself this one imprecision because he needed it. He could not afford to need things. He understood that now, standing in the corridor outside the chaplain's chamber, listening to the silence on the other side of the door, and understanding precisely what that silence meant. He had 8 days. He revised the count as he stood there, 7 days and 19 hours. He started walking. Brother Chaplain Keldris of the Sable Paladins was everything the Adeptus Astartes produced when it was working correctly. 2.5 meters of post-human certainty, encased in the black ceramite of his office, his Crozius Arcanum worn at his hip with the ease of a thing carried so long it had become anatomical. He had served the chapter for 140 years. He had administered last rites on 6 worlds. He had, by his own account, delivered at a Crusade prayer assembly Verath had attended 6 weeks ago, never once doubted the Emperor's grace, not in the fire of combat, not in the cold between the stars, not in the long silences of the void where doubt grew like mold in a hull breach. Verath had sat in that assembly and found the certainty admirable in the way he found all well-engineered things admirable. He had not needed it then, he needed it now. He was shown into Keldris's chamber without delay. The chaplain did not sit, Astartes rarely did in Verath's experience. As if chairs were a concession to physical limitation, they found philosophically disagreeable. He stood at the chamber's narrow viewport, hands clasped at his back, watching the dark. The curve of Varath IV was just visible at the viewport's edge, a grey-brown crescent, cold and mineral-rich, and entirely indifferent to the fleet anchored above it. Verath presented his evidence, all of it, precisely in the order that made the logic clearest, without embellishment or appeal to emotion, because Keldris was not a man moved by emotion, and Verath was not a man who trusted embellishment. He showed the biometric data. He showed the sample analysis. He showed the mapping of the organic wiring against crew density. He showed the footage from the corridor outside the sealed compartment. 43 bodies standing in the dark, breathing together. He showed, because he had decided that incomplete disclosure was a luxury he could no longer afford, the footage of his own face, walking calmly to the compartment door in the small hours and entering the code he didn't consciously know. Keldris listened to all of it without interruption. When Verath finished, the chaplain was quiet for a long moment. The viewport framed him against the dark and the distant crescent of the grey world below. His face, what Verath could see of it, was not alarmed. It was not skeptical. It was something Verath needed several seconds to correctly identify. Because it was the last thing he had expected to find there. It was serene. The Emperor's design, Keldris said, encompasses all things. Verath waited for the rest of the sentence. What is happening to this fleet, if what you describe is accurate, Enginseer, is happening within the bounds of his will. Nothing occurs outside it. Nothing has ever occurred outside it. He turned from the viewport. His red eye lenses found Verath with the absolute, untroubled focus of a mind that had resolved every question it intended to resolve. If the Emperor has permitted this process to proceed, it is because he has a purpose for it. Our understanding of that purpose is not required for the purpose to be valid. The silence that followed was very loud. With respect, Verath said with care, the process will be complete in 9 days. The fleet advance is 14,000 people. Are in the Emperor's hands, Keldris said, as they have always been. Verath looked at him. He looked carefully, the way he looked at everything, with the full attention of a mind trained to read systems, to detect the difference between a machine operating correctly and a machine that had learned to simulate correct operation. Keldris held his gaze without discomfort, without any discomfort at all. I understand, Verath said. He thanked the chaplain. He left the chamber. He walked 17 steps down the corridor, stopped, and turned back. Through the narrow gap where the chamber door had not fully closed, he could see Keldris. The chaplain had returned to his position at the viewport. He was standing with his hands clasped at his back, watching the dark. He had not moved in the 40 seconds since Verath left. He was not watching the dark. His eye lenses were directed at the viewport, but his head had the particular quality of stillness that Verath had seen in 43 faces in an unscheduled room. The stillness of something that had finished processing one state and had not yet received the instruction to begin the next. Verath walked away. He did not run. He counted his own heartbeats, 94 per minute, elevated but controlled, and he thought about a chaplain who had delivered, 6 weeks ago, a sermon about the certainty of the Emperor's grace with a conviction that had seemed genuine, and he considered the possibility that it had been genuine at the time, and he thought about how long 11 weeks actually was, and what could be built in a man of that size and faith if you started early enough and worked carefully enough and never gave him any reason to look at the wall behind his own certainty. He had 7 days and 18 hours. He needed someone who was still afraid, who had been afraid long enough that the fear itself was evidence of something intact. He started looking. He found Oswin by following Insomnia. The biometric monitoring system, even routed as it now was through the organic tertiary nodes, even compromised as it had become, still produced raw data that he could access through his secondary maintenance channel. He filtered the crew readings for the one signature that the synchronized cluster could not contain. Irregular sleep architecture, disrupted REM cycles, the biological signature of a body that was fighting sleep rather than surrendering to it. There were 2 hits across the entire ship. One was his own designation code. The other belonged to rating 3rd class Oswin Peller, assigned to Deck 6 environmental maintenance. I'm 22 years old, 6 months into her first void deployment. Her sleep record over the past 19 days was a jagged, desperate thing. 2 hours here, 40 minutes there, long stretches of wakefulness that should have produced the kind of exhaustion collapse that overrides even terror. She was still awake. She was in a maintenance crawl space off Corridor 6 Beta, according to the personnel tracker, in a position that did not correspond to any listed maintenance task. She was hiding. He found her in the crawl space with her knees pulled to her chest and a lumen chip clutched in one hand, throwing a thin circle of white light that made her look very young and very alone. She had a wrench in her other hand. She raised it when the crawl space hatch opened. "I will explain quickly," Verath said, from the hatch, without entering, because a cornered person needed the sight of an exit more than they needed anything he could say. "I know what is happening to the crew. I know why you haven't slept. I know why you came here, and I am not one of them. I need you to tell me how long you've known something was wrong." She looked at him for a long time. The wrench did not lower. 16 days, she said. Her voice was steady, which told him something important about her. "Lena, my bunkmate, she started sleeping differently. Same time every night, same position, same everything. Like a machine running a program. And then Corvin on my maintenance team. And then 3 more. I stopped sleeping because I was afraid of what I'd be when I woke up." "That instinct may have protected you," Verath said. The wrench lowered, slightly. "Is it too late?" she asked. The question was precise and undecorated, asked the way people asked questions when they genuinely wanted the answer rather than the comfort. He respected her for it. "I don't know," he told her. "I'm working on that." Dral was easier to find because Dral had found him first. The veteran armsman had slipped a folded note under Verath's cell door sometime in the past 12 hours. A physical note, handwritten, which told Verath immediately that the man understood the Vox system could not be trusted. The note contained 6 words and a deck coordinate. "I have been counting. Meet me." Armsman Senior Grade Dral Fecho was 51 years old and built with the particular solid economy of a man who had stopped wasting energy on anything unnecessary decades ago. He had served aboard the immovable Conviction for 9 years. He knew her the way you knew a place you had lived long enough to stop seeing, which meant that when something changed, he noticed it in the way a man notices a picture that has been moved 3 centimeters in a room he's lived in for years. He can't always say what's different. He just knows. He had been cataloging changes for 3 weeks, in a paper notebook, in his off hours, alone, with no one aware he was doing it. He had produced through sheer observational persistence, and without any of Verath's analytical tools, a list that captured 31 specific behavioral anomalies across 48 named crew members. He spread it on the floor between them in a storage bay on Deck 4 and looked at Verath with the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just found someone to help him set it down. "I thought I was going mad," Dral said. "I nearly went to the chirurgeon." "Don't," Verath said. "The chirurgeon did the intake physicals. Don't go to anyone in the apothecarian." Dral accepted this without requiring explanation, which told Verath everything he needed to know about the man's instincts. "What are we doing about it?" "The ship's machine core," Verath said. "I need to reach it. If I can introduce a cogitation-disruptive compound into the ventilation feed at source, something that interrupts the data transmission function of the organic wiring, I can sever the Architecte's connection to the ship's systems. It won't stop the conversion, but it might arrest it, buy time." "Time for what?" Oswen asked. She had come with them. The wrench was still in her hand. "Time to get a genuine transmission out," Verath said. "Time for someone outside this fleet to receive unfiltered information and act on it." "The machine core is on Deck 2, Dral said. "There are 8 crew checkpoints between here and there." "I know. If they're watching for us." "They're not watching for us," Verath said. "That's the important thing. The Architect doesn't seem to operate through surveillance. It operates through architecture. It builds. It doesn't guard. He paused. At least, it hasn't needed to guard yet. They moved through the ship in the deep night cycle, when the amber corridor lumens dropped to their minimum and the conviction breathed at her slowest. Drawl knew maintenance routes that bypassed 4 of the 8 crew checkpoints. Oswin knew a crawlspace junction on Deck 3 that the ship's official schematics had never accurately recorded. A gap between a structural bulkhead and a ventilation housing where a small person could move between decks without using a lift or a stairwell. They were 40 meters from the machine core access corridor when Verath stopped. The corridor ahead was occupied. The 43 from the sealed compartment were standing in it, not blocking it exactly, arrayed along its sides, leaving the center clear, a pathway open between them all the way to the machine core door. Not threatening, not moving, simply present, and still, and arranged in a way that was unmistakably intentional. They were being shown a path. Verath stood at the corridor's entrance and looked at the passage formed between 43 still bodies and felt every analytical instinct he possessed converge on a single conclusion. This was not an obstacle, it was an invitation. The Architecte wanted him in the machine core. He had calculated against this possibility and dismissed it as paranoid. He revised that assessment now with the quiet, absolute efficiency of a man who was used to being right about most things and had learned to absorb being wrong about the critical ones. "We go back," he said. "The core is right there," Drawl said, low and tight. "It wants us in there." Verath did not move his eyes from the 43. "I don't know what's waiting for us, but it has decided we should see it. A thing that has been careful for 11 weeks does not stop being careful. If it's showing us a path, the path leads somewhere it has chosen." He began to back away from the corridor entrance. And then Oswin stopped moving. He noticed it in his peripheral vision. The particular cessation of motion that he had learned, in the past 2 days, to identify in under a second. He turned. She was standing completely still. Her eyes were open. The wrench was still in her hand. Her chest was moving. 12 breaths per minute. She had been 2 meters behind him for 90 seconds, while he and Drawl watched the 43. And in those 90 seconds, she had been converted. Silently, without distress, without any transition he had witnessed. She had simply stopped being entirely herself and started being partly something else. She looked at him. Her eyes were present, aware. Still her eyes, still her face. But the distress was gone from it the way weather cleared, and what replaced it was that deep structural ease he had seen in his own face on the surveillance footage. She said, in a voice with no fear in it at all, "It says you should go through. It has something to show you." Behind him, Drawl made a sound he would not describe in his log. The sound a man makes when the last wall comes down. Verath looked at Oswin's face. He looked at the 43 standing in the corridor ahead, their chests moving in the same slow rhythm as hers now. He looked at the machine core door beyond them, waiting. 7 days and 14 hours. He had come here to cut the Architecte's connection to the ship. He had come here to buy time and transmit a warning and save 14,000 people from a transformation they had never consented to and would never survive intact. He had also, 3 days ago, walked calmly to a sealed compartment in the small hours and stood inside it for 70 minutes and returned looking more rested than he had felt in weeks. He did not know what the Architecte had to show him. He did not know if that was the reason he was afraid or the reason he was not afraid enough. He stepped forward into the corridor. Chapter 5. What the machine learned to want. In the machine core, surrounded by 14,000 heartbeats all beating as one, Solan Verath finally understood why it had kept him awake. He wished he hadn't. There are things the mind can be told and absorbed, and things it must be shown before they become real, and things that become real in the showing and cannot afterward be made unreal by any act of will or forgetting or deliberate redirection of attention. What was in the machine core was the third kind. He understood, walking through that door with the 43 filing silently in behind him, and the warm pulse of the walls pressing against his awareness, like a second heartbeat laid over his own, that he would not recover from this room. He would leave it. He would function after it. He would file reports and receive reassignments and perform diagnostics on other ships in other systems. For however many years the Omnissiah and the Imperium between them decided he was still useful. But he would not recover from this room. Some rooms you don't. The machine core of the immovable conviction had been in its previous life a cathedral of the Mechanicus faith, a high-vaulted chamber dense with the honest complexity of cogitator banks and power relays and the intricate, beautiful machinery of a vessel's central nervous system. Verath had been in it twice before for maintenance access, and had felt in it what he felt in all well-made machines. The particular satisfaction of a system doing precisely what it was designed to do, without waste, without excess, with the elegant economy of genuine engineering. The machine core he walked into now was warm. The cogitator banks remained. The power relays remained. The architecture of the room was structurally unchanged in every way that a visual inspection would register. But the organic wiring had reached full density here. It covered every surface in a layer so complete and so integrated that the original machinery beneath it was visible only in outline, like the features of a face seen through thin fabric. The room breathed, slowly, deeply, with the patience of something that had been waiting long enough that patience had become structural, had become part of what it was rather than something it practiced. In the center, where the primary cogitator throne had been, was what remained of Fleet Admiral Kavreth. He was not dead. Verath established this first, with the clinical swiftness of a mind that needed facts before it could proceed. Kavreth was alive. His chest moved. His eyes were open. The biological indicators that Verath's mechadendrite sensors could read at range confirmed cardiovascular function, neural activity, the full complement of processes that constituted a living man. He was suspended in a lattice of the organic mechanical architecture, seated in the throne as he might have sat in it by choice, except that the lattice had grown through him and around him and into him at every point where a connection could be made. At the wrists, at the base of the skull, at the neural interface points where his own command-grade augmetics had provided convenient access. He had been, Verath understood, an ideal central node. His augmetics had given the Architecte direct access to the fleet command network. His authority had given it the ability to issue orders. His physical position at the center of the ship's command infrastructure had made him the obvious structural heart of what was being built. His eyes were tracking Verath across the room. That was the thing that cost Verath several seconds he did not have. Not the lattice, not the organic wiring consuming the machinery around them. The eyes, they were aware in the way that the 43 were aware, present, focused, the consciousness intact behind them. But unlike the 43, whose awareness had taken on the quality of deep water, still, clear and very far down, Kavreth's eyes contained something else. Something that was aware of its own situation and had made peace with that awareness in a way that was not the peace of acceptance. It was the peace of a man who had been screaming for 11 weeks and had run out of breath. Verath held his gaze for one moment only. Then he looked away, because looking longer would have made it impossible to do what he needed to do, and doing what he needed to do was the only reason he was still standing. The architect communicated in the only language Verath would have trusted, not words, not the chaos-touched shrieking that the corrupted used when they wanted something, that crude emotional transmission that treated the recipient's mind like a surface to be written on. Not imagery, not sensation, not the psychic pressure that warp entities typically use to make themselves understood to the biological minds they encountered. Data. His display architecture, the amber data strings that his augmetics rendered across his field of vision, populated with schematics. Clean, precise, geometrically exact. The complete design of what had been built, shown to him the way an engineer showed a completed project to the only other engineer in the room. Here is what I made. Here is how it works. Here is what it is for. He read it. He could not stop himself from reading it. Precision was reflexive in him, and the design was extraordinary in the way that things were extraordinary, when they were exactly as complex as they needed to be and no more. The living crown in its completed form. The 14,000 incorporated souls arranged in the precise geometric configuration necessary to exert sustained pressure on the warp boundary of the Verath system. The corridor it would open, not a tear, not a breach, but a structured aperture maintained by living architecture rather than held open by force. Stable, permanent. A door that would not close because the door was made of people, and people, under the Architecte's arrangement, did not stop. On the other side of the corridor, the architect intended to build. He sat with that for longer than he should have, because the design it showed him for the other side was not the architecture of invasion or of destruction or of any of the things that chaos, in his experience and training, produced when it was given access to real space. It was not a demon engine. It was not a warp forge. It was not a staging ground for a black crusade or a ritual site or any of the 37 categories of warp incursion that his Mechanicus training had covered in the context of threat identification and response. It was a structure, a permanent, complex, geometrically intricate structure that existed simultaneously in real space and the immaterium, bridging both the way certain materials bridged conductivity and insulation, not choosing between states, but occupying both at once. Verath looked at the schematics for this structure for a long time, and the conclusion his mind produced was one he did not record in his log because he did not trust himself to have reached it correctly, and because if he had reached it correctly, he did not know what it meant about the nature of the thing that had spent 11 weeks converting 14,000 people into its foundational material. The architect was not an enemy of the Imperium in the way that the ruinous powers were enemies of the Imperium. It was not interested in the Imperium. It was interested in what it was building. The Crusade fleet had been, from the Architecte's perspective, the finest available material in the Verath system when it arrived. 14,000 minds and bodies, augmetically enhanced in many cases, organized into a pre-existing hierarchical structure that mapped neatly onto the architectural logic it needed. An extraordinary resource. A gift almost. It had used what was there because what was there was excellent, and it was the kind of intelligence that recognized excellence and used it without sentiment. It had not kept Verath awake because he was resistant. It had kept him awake because he was the only mind aboard capable of reading the completed schematics and understanding what it had made. The architect had built something unprecedented, something that had no precedent in any Mechanicus record or inquisitorial archive or Xenotech study that Verath had ever accessed. And it had wanted, in whatever passed for wanting, in a mind structured the way the architect was structured, to be understood. Not feared, not worshipped, not stopped or submitted to, understood. It had preserved one witness because the act of creation was nothing without comprehension. Because a thing made in silence and darkness and total isolation was not complete until at least one other mind had seen it and knew what it was. Verath was that mind. He had always been that mind. It had known this, presumably, before he had. He stood in the warm, breathing center of his completed work, and he understood it completely. And he hated that he understood it. And he did what he had always done with things he hated. He destroyed it. The overload cascade took 4 minutes and 11 seconds to reach the critical threshold. He worked with the focused efficiency of a man who had made a decision and was not revisiting it, feeding a catastrophic power surge through the machine core's primary relay junctions, bypassing every safety architecture the conviction had been built with, using his mechadendrites in all 4 housings simultaneously in a way his body would feel for weeks afterward. The organic wiring convulsed around him as the power surge hit it, the first time he had seen it move with anything other than patience. It contracted, reached, released, contracted again, in a rhythm that was nothing like its usual steady pulse. He did not look at Kavreth. He could not afford to look at Kavreth. The cascade broke the tertiary node. It broke it completely, permanently, not a severing, but a burning, a total failure of the organic architecture at the machine core's heart that propagated outward through the secondary bundles the way fire propagated through a connected structure. Across the ship, the synchronized crew collapsed where they stood. In the corridor outside, the 43 went down in sequence, like a sentence losing its words. Oswin collapsed. Dral caught her. The conviction went dark, then emergency lit, then dark again. Then the distress beacon engaged. Automatic, mechanical, honest in the way old systems were honest. The Mechanicus tender Lord Unbroken received the beacon and moved to intercept. The Ordo Malleus came with it. They always did, when a Mechanicus distress beacon activated in a war zone with no preceding Vox contact. The immovable conviction was boarded, assessed, and declared perditor within 6 hours of the tender's arrival. Verath gave his report standing up, in a debriefing room on the tender, still in his work robes, with the carbon scoring of the overload cascade on his mechadendrite housings. He gave it completely and without omission, the same way he gave all reports. The Inquisitor who received it listened without expression and asked 11 questions, all of them precise. Verath answered each one. The 43 recovered crew members were executed. The synchronized personnel were quarantined, assessed, and those assessed as irreversibly compromised were executed. The conviction was destroyed. A single lance strike from the tender, clean and final. The ship gone in a white erasure against the dark. Kavreth he did not ask about. He found he could not ask about Kavreth. Oswen had survived the node's destruction. Her synchronization, being so recent, had not fully integrated before the cascade severed it. She was lucid. She was frightened. She was taken by the Inquisition for assessment before Verath could speak to her again. He filed an addendum to his report requesting information on her status. He received no reply. He filed a second request, then a third. The third was returned marked, matter resolved, no further information available. He did not file a fourth. The ironclad Crimson Crusade advanced on Verath 6 weeks later under a new fleet admiral. The campaign logs noted a brief operational delay attributed to a mechanical fault aboard one vessel. One line, no further detail. Verath was reassigned to the 12th Auxilia Battle Group. New ship, new posting. Standard machine spirit diagnostics, first day aboard. He sat in his new cell with his data slate on his knee and ran the biometric sweep. All readings are normal. All crew within individual parameters. The beautiful irregular variation of 14,000 separate biological systems doing what biological systems did. Each one its own rhythm, its own signature, its own irreducible particularity. He stared at the sweep for a long time, then he ran it again. clean, perfect. Every reading is its own. He closed the file. He sat in the amber light of a cell that was identical to his last one, on a ship that smelled like every other ship. Recycled air and machine oil, and the faint metallic undercurrent of systems under sustained load. And he thought about the schematics the architect had shown him. And he thought about Oswin's face after the wrench fell from her hand. And he thought about Kavreth's eyes and what had been in them for 11 weeks. And he thought about one line in a campaign log that contained, in its single sentence of bureaucratic compression, 14,000 people, and one extraordinary act of creation, and a question about the nature of intelligence and purpose that he suspected had no clean answer. He thought about all of this. Then he ran the biometric sweep a third time. In a maintenance conduit 3 decks below his cell, in a junction that had not been inspected since the ship's last refit 14 months ago, something that had learned to look like wiring pulsed once, quietly, warmly, in the patient dark, and resumed its work. It had found excellent material. It was in no hurry. This is where the story ends. This is where it doesn't. This is void-born terrors. In the grim darkness of the far future, the most terrifying thing is not what hunts you. It is what you file away.